Now, the Ramsay Centre, with its scholars, its scholarship programs, its degree programs, and of course those are the kind of lion's share of what we do. Important as the lecture series is, most of our remit covers the scholarship programs and the degree programs. So the centre in that capacity is, I'd say, the principal beneficiary of Australia's largest ever philanthropic endowment. And we're mindful of this every day, mindful of what Paul Ramsay has done, how much he's done for the Australian community, particularly in the higher education space. And so in a very real sense, as a charitable enterprise with DGR status, we are always aware of the meaning of philanthropy as something concrete that we can do for people because of what Paul Ramsay himself did. So given all of that background, we thought there was no better way to relaunch this live lecture series than by hearing from the outgoing president of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, the ACNC, namely the Honourable Gary Johns, and hear from him what he's learned about the charity sector during his tenure in that office. Just very briefly, by way of introduction, although I'm sure many of you know very well who Gary is, but he was a long-standing ALP member of the House of Representatives from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. He was a minister in the Keating government, where he held a number of significant roles. But since leaving Parliament, Gary's held many other roles, including, I'll just mention a couple, at the Productivity Commission, where he was Associate Commissioner. He was also an inaugural board member at Volunteers Australia. He completed a PhD. He won a Fulbright scholarship to study at Georgetown University in DC in the United States. He won the Centenary Medal for service to the Australian community, I think in 2003, Gary. And furthermore, in addition to all of that, he's written 9 books. So he has not let the grass grow under his feet since leaving Parliament. Gary Johns was appointed Commissioner at the ACNC by the Turnbull government in 2017. We believe no one is better qualified than he is to speak to us on the topic tonight, charity enhancing its value for Australian society. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gary Johns.
Well, it is an honour to address the Ramsay Centre and to take time to reflect on what I've learned in the last 4.5 years or so. I finish on Friday and I look forward to getting my name back. You don't realise the disciplines of being a public servant. I've said to my 120 staff that I've sworn twice in 4.5 years, which is remarkable, because I don't know if I should mention this in the face of a Prime Minister here, but politics can be a rough game and the language does deteriorate. However, I've reclaimed my language, I assure you, and these reflections on the sector come essentially from my constituency work. I've spent a lot of time travelling Australia talking to charities. And if you want to learn about a sector, you talk to the constituents and ask them what they do. And they're ever so grateful to receive a visit and to tell you what they do, because by and large, these are good people, these are doers. So here are some reflections about what the rest of us could do to help the sector, which by and large is in good fettle, but there are some things we could do to help. Now, not all charity is delivered by charities. However, for our purposes and as the charities regulator, I'll concentrate on the work of charities in this discussion of the value of charity to Australian society. In exploring the value of charity, 4 truths are prominent and 4 questions arise. First, every dollar raised and spent on a charitable purpose has an opportunity cost. Bruce Bonyhady, perhaps the most important person in the establishment of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, commented while 500,000 people were able to access support under the $30 billion scheme, those outside the scheme, the so-called Tier 2 disabled, received very little. Now, charitable causes compete with other charitable causes and with non-charitable causes like defence and roads, without which charity could barely function. What will not be achieved if those outside the NDIS scheme receive new funds? Second, charities operate between government and the private sector. A traditional assumption among leftist politics is that all needs unmet by the market should be met by government, which is why the left has often disdained charity, especially voluntary effort. The apparent rapprochement in recent years between the charity sector, or more accurately its spokespersons, and the left is because so much of the sector delivers government services. Now, the right is comfortable with charity and volunteer effort, although the shibboleth of limited government has somewhat weakened in recent years. The private sector is often engaged with charities. However, there is a trend to subsume charitable support within corporate social responsibility, now called ESG, environmental, social and corporate governance. Do charities continue to add value when they become supplicants to either or both of the other sectors and their ideologies? Are they independent of those sectors and their thinking? Which leads to the third truth. Charity advocacy has mostly been grounded in charitable works, not disembodied ideology. Using the example of ESG, if a welfare charity wishes to be environmentally responsible, how much of its money should be spent to save the environment, and if spent, how much will not be spent on the charitable purpose? Fourth, charities have been successful at being exempted from taxation. In this sense, the Australian public underwrites charities. Does the public know what they get for their money? It may seem impertinent to raise these issues given charities have been in Australia almost since the beginning of European settlement. For example, the Benevolent Society, first known as the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and Benevolence, was established in 1813. Raising these issues is essential precisely because so much has changed since that time. So let me count the ways in which charities have added value to Australian society. On the 200th anniversary of the Benevolent Society, the curator of the State Library of New South Wales observed that while it was Australia's oldest charity, it was also, quote, the oldest continuous organisation apart from government, end of quote. Now, following the 2020 bushfires, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission reviewed the work of Red Cross and two other charities, which had received millions of dollars in donations to help those who suffered. Raising funds for charitable purposes, for example on social media, seems easy, but dispersing those funds to beneficiaries is not so easy. It requires organisation. Red Cross assessed 15,000 applications for grants during the 2020 bushfires. Charities add the great value of organisation. Red Cross gave the example of 850 people who sought help 6 months after the bushfires had ceased. Apparently, delayed claims are common. Only an experienced organisation would know to retain some funds for those people. The average age of Australia's 60,000 registered charities is 32 years. Charities add the great value of experience. It's highly likely that the initial funds for the Benevolent Society were raised from donations. Asking members of the public for support ensures that charities are independent of government, and many other charities do the same. The New South Wales Wildlife Information, Rescue and Education Service, for example, which was involved in the 2020 bushfire response, received and managed $90 million in donations. So charities add the great value of independence. Volunteers are an essential part of charity work, or at least they were at the outset of the Benevolent Society. The New South Wales Rural Fire Service Trust, also involved in the 2020 bushfire response, assisted 70,000 volunteer members of rural services. In 2020, there were 3.4 million volunteers working in Australian charities. Charities add the great value of volunteers. At its outset, the Benevolent Society helped unmarried mothers, destitute children, and elderly ex-convicts. Presently, the Benevolent Society seeks to, quote unquote, prevent social problems, in part by advocacy to government about law and public programs. And charities add the great value of public advocacy. Now, charitable endeavours may be less targeted to a group of individuals than was once the case, and more to a concept, for example, reconciliation or how to save the world environment. For these and more traditional issues, charities have a way of thinking about problems and a conception of the good society. This is sometimes referred to as a theory of change, but may also be conceived as ideology. Charities add the great value of offering competing theories of change. Now, religion was and remains the most common charitable purpose. Education has also been significant throughout. Social services and health have grown over time. Housing and culture have increased since the 1970s. Environmental charities have grown particularly since the early 1980s. And since 2010, the number of animal-related charities has grown, as have those for international and human rights. Charities add the great value of expanded charitable purposes. Now, these many values are important contributions to Australian society. Now let me tell you what's happening in the sector and how this may weaken those values. In 2020, the revenue of charities in Australia was $178 billion. However, of the $178 billion, the main elements were $89 billion came from government, $57 billion came from the sale of goods and services, much of which was government subsidised, and $13 billion came from donations and bequests. Was the value of the charity contribution $178 billion or $13 billion or somewhere in between? In 2020, more than 80% of the revenue of the sector was generated by large charities such as universities and hospitals. By contrast, half of all charities had revenue less than $250,000 per year and employed no staff. Very large charities derive 3% of their revenue from donations and bequests. Extra small charities derive 40% of their revenue from donations and bequests. The ratio of volunteers to employed staff in large charities is 1 to 1. The ratio of volunteers to employed staff in small charities is 18 to 1. Sydney University, for example, is a charity. Its income in 2021 was $2.6 billion and it employed 8,000 staff. Most of its funds came from government grants or government subsidised fees for education services. Donations were a minor source of income. The Brisbane charity Zephyr Education supplies school uniforms and books to the children of women who have sought refuge in a women's shelter. Its income in 2021 was $600,000. Its income was drawn entirely from donations and its staff were voluntary. Some charities raise no funds and do not carry the name charity in their advertising. They are, to all intents and purposes, not-for-profit government service providers and contractors. Now, they've probably grown from a charity base and they retain the status because their purpose remains charitable. An original asset, say a community hall, has long passed into the accounts and is maintained as part of the business. More than 400 charities with public benevolent institution status, a class of charity, have a single responsible person. This is not a strong basis on which to run an institution. Some charities deliver no services. They raise funds from donors with the sole intention of lobbying government for a change to law or for funds. This shift away from services to voices runs the risk of charities drifting into ideology. Some charities will slip into public debate ideas foreign to charity. For example, some argue for equality as the means to eliminate poverty. Equality, however, is not a charitable purpose. The words equality, fair and equitable, so often used by those in the sector, do not appear in the list of charitable purposes in the Charities Act. Some charities will prefer one means of poverty alleviation over others. I cannot recall in 50 years of observation, for example, a statement of support for free trade from a foreign aid charity. And yet free trade is one of the most potent drivers of poverty alleviation. More broadly, the more contestable the charity theory of change, the more susceptible the charity is to weaken the value it adds to society. Now, these potential weaknesses in the chain of value, reliance on government funds, loss of economic independence, low reliance on volunteers, drift in purpose, thin governance, and advocacy based on theories of change rather than practice can be strengthened. Based on my experience as Commissioner and in the spirit of passing to others for their consideration, here are 4 suggestions on how to strengthen these values. First, provide the public with clear evidence of what charities do. Second, anchor independence in donations and volunteers and advocacy in practice. 3, insist on stronger institutional forms of governance. And 4, provide donor taxation incentives for all charities in return for the disciplines of public benevolent institution status. So let's go to the first. Provide the public with clear evidence of what charities do. Voters have made clear for generations that governments are not obliged to do everything. With the same taxation relief as charities, non-charitable not-for-profits, or indeed for-profits, may do as well as charities. The NDIS is beginning to prove this. Charities need to demonstrate added value in pursuit of their charitable purposes. How is the pursuit, let alone the achievement of the purpose, known? Knowing what a charity does is essential, especially as the public is expected to subsidise the activity. For example, charities must carry out their charitable purpose for public benefit. Now, this test provides only an opaque opportunity to know what charities do. However, law built around measuring what charities do, how effective or efficient they are at doing it, would be very burdensome. The issue is how to provide information that would satisfy the public's need to know what charities do at little burden to the charity and little cost to the donor. The solution rests in simple, comparable information. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Act requires that the Commission provide, quote, information to help the public understand the work of the sector, end of quote. Now, the solution to the information question lies in the language that charities use to describe their work, the programs charities run for their beneficiaries. Programs provide useful information to a wide range of potential users: philanthropists, donors, researchers, service users, volunteers, governments and charities. In addition to 60,000 charities on the ACNC register, as of December last year, there are nearly 80,000 programs described there. Now, a register does not substitute for experience, but it enhances it, or it can lead to further options in giving, volunteering, or collaboration. The public response to the enhanced register has been superb. Searches of the register have risen from 4.5 million last year to more than 7 million on an annualised basis since its launch. Second, to anchor independence in donations and volunteers and advocacy and practice. Now, charities often use governments to raise funds, and in doing so, they use government compulsion instead of voluntary donations. The leading case in charity board independence determined that the degree of government financial involvement does not deprive an entity of charitable status. But there's a significant difference between the legal and the economic concept of independence. About 300 charities are entirely reliant on government, and about 2,500 receive more than 90% of their income from government. Auditors regularly make economic independence or dependency disclosure notes in a charity's accounts. They comment that over-reliance on government grants and contracts is a risk to the viability of the organisation. It would be too disruptive and impractical to have a rule about an acceptable level of government funds to sustain charitable status. Nevertheless, to retain the unique nature of charity organisations, charities should endeavour to raise funds directly from donors. In the same vein, they should also endeavour to recruit volunteers. Fundraising and volunteer recruitment should not be allowed to wither in the face of government largesse. Charities should also inform the public of the source of their government funds. A simple line in the accounts with the department or departments from which the contract or grant scheme came would suffice. Now, charities have had a public voice for a very long time, a voice subsidised by taxpayers. While it's permissible for a charity to do no more than lobby government, as many have observed, there's something unsatisfactory about taxpayers' money being used to fund charities that are campaigning for things that we may disagree with. A major legal debate at present is whether those who do not deliver services to beneficiaries should gain access to donor tax deductions by gaining Public Benevolent Institution, PBI, status. The blocker to the award of PBI status is that they, quote, must have a clear mechanism for the delivery of relief, unquote. They need to do some concrete charity work. Advocacy alone, even in the pursuit of charitable purposes, does not prove the value of charity work. Advocacy alone is disembodied, nothing more than ideology dressed up as charity, and any citizen or political party can do that. Lobbying informed by charitable practice, however, is a value that few others could match. With respect to voice, the only contested matter in a free society is whether one group is provided with taxpayer support and another not. Why would a charity be subsidised to be purely political? Point number 3. Insist on stronger institutional forms of government. All charities should be associations of people in pursuit of charitable purposes. Unfortunately, there are many charities controlled by one person. But how can one person be held accountable? How can they be independent? How can they manage conflicts of interest? To whom do they report the fulfilment of their obligations as a responsible person? Single persons should not be held to be a charity. A new rule that insists on a minimum number of responsible persons would be simple to legislate. And 4, provide donor taxation incentives for all charities in return for the disciplines of public benevolent institution status. So there is a solution to the weakness of ungrounded advocacy. There are at least 2 classes of charity taxation benefits. Those where the donor gets tax relief, called deductible gift recipient, and those where they do not, although both classes may receive relief in the form of income tax, GST and FBT exemptions, and state tax exemptions. About 60% of charities do not have donor taxation relief. Clearly, some charities are thought to be more charitable than others. The reason for this differential treatment stems from an attempt by the Commonwealth Government in 1923 to confine charitable status to benevolence, as opposed to, quote, other charitable purposes for public benefit, end of quote. Now, the fight to contain the popular concept of charitable to benevolence was lost in the courts, indeed the Privy Council, and the Commonwealth Parliament declined to change the definition of charity handed down by the Privy Council, but instead created a new class of tax entity, the public benevolent institution, which gave access to donor tax deductions and others. Now, there are now more than 40 general groupings and 219 specially listed deductible gift recipients. In Australia alone, there is a purpose test for charity and an entity test for deductible gift recipient charities. But what if all charities were granted donor tax relief? In 2010, the Productivity Commission argued that DGR status should be extended to all charities. In 2013, a Treasury paper recommended extension of DGR status to all charities with some carve-outs. A proposal worth considering is that registered charities should be eligible for donor tax relief as per the Treasury recommendation, and in return, charities must have a means of delivering on their purpose. That's the Gary Johns recommendation. A further suggestion provides that DGRs must not have a purpose as described in section 12(1)L of the Charities Act. Quote, the purpose of promoting or opposing a change to any matter established by law, end of quote, whether as a predominant purpose or an ancillary or incidental purpose. Now, this wouldn't necessarily preclude DGRs from undertaking single activities of advocacy, provided they didn't amount to an independent purpose of advocacy. The change is analogous to the prohibition on a purpose of advocacy in support of a political party, which is in the Charities Act. Although that section is somewhat ineffectual and runs the risk of charities being involved in political debate, often to their detriment, it does provide charities some pause for thought. Because the two purposes tests, advocacy and partisan advocacy, are very low bars to overcome for charities that wish to advocate, charities should not be allowed to spend funds raised in the name of charity on political advertising, partisan or not. Political advertising is not a good use of charitable funds. In conclusion, each of these changes should be considered as a contribution to refocusing charity to its distinctive contribution to Australian society. To reiterate, all charities should be granted the privilege of a tax deduction for the donor. In return, there should be conditions, namely, charities must satisfy a clear means of delivering test. Charities must attempt to raise donations. Charities must attempt to recruit volunteers. Charities must report the source of government funds, and there must be a minimum number of responsible persons. Charities must satisfy a no independent or ancillary or incidental advocacy purpose test. And lastly, no charity funds should be spent on political campaign advertising. I believe that these modest changes would strengthen the distinctive contribution charities make to Australian society, including justifying the support of Australians through taxation and the opportunity costs implicit in charity work. Now, for those charities that think that this is burdensome, they're free to not seek taxpayer support and just get on with their business. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. It's a real privilege to be able to hear such a thoughtful account of a major public institution from the current incumbent of the role of running it. And I'm sure many of you will have questions that you'd like to ask Gary as a follow-up to all the things that he said. Perhaps I can just kick off, Gary, by looking at something, or turning to something that you said just towards the end of your account, and I think it was your fourth suggestion. And that was, I'm just interested in, I mean, the Ramsay Centre is always interested in the long historical picture. And you mentioned a Privy Council decision in 1923, so almost exactly 100 years ago, which went against what the recommendation of the Australian government was, and created a distinction between benevolent institutions and public benefit. And I'm just wondering, and presumably that was then carried forward and eventually reflected in the 2013 Act that you're talking about. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more? I'm just saying this is an ignoramus in this area. What is the distinction that the government had in mind that the Privy Council wouldn't allow us to make?
Well, it's the old one. It's the fight between conservatives and progressives. And the progressives won, as always. And governments do what governments always do. Every child gets a prize. Right. So you you allowed the broadening of the definition of charity, right. And then to keep the other group happy, you had this different definition in tax, which was a public benevolent institution, and different tests apply, but there were greater taxation benefits. And I forget now, 15 or 20 years ago, we did the same thing again. We defined a different class of charity called a health promotion charity. Again, a different test, a different class of charitable support. I think we could do a grand deal here and put them all in together and take the rules that apply to a PBI and apply them to all charities. In return, all charities get the donor deduction. Right. It'd be a lot simpler, but the trick here is that I'm not rewriting law, I'm applying the same laws to the broader class.
Right. The key thing then, I take it, being the transparently visible delivery of concrete benefit, concrete public benefit.
Yeah, this is the kicker. I see the rise of a class of charity where funds are raised to train kids, anyone under 50 is a kid, to lobby government for money. I just cannot conceive that that is charitable, but it's legal. And I'm really saying, why don't you prove that you do something for the money? Then I can distinguish between your worldview, your theory of change, your ideology, and what you've learned in practice. And most charities in Australia, and certainly the big ones, have so much to offer because they have practice. They understand what it takes to recover a person's life or a forest after a bushfire. I think you can rely on that. I don't think you can rely on this stuff.
Yeah, so you're obviously your key concern here is that too many charities are actually advocacy or kind of lobbying enterprises, meaning they're in the business of promoting ideas rather than delivering concrete assistance to where there is need. Yeah. How did that come about? How's that grown? How's that number of charities that are doing advocacy rather than delivering concretely? How did that come about? How did that number grow?
Many charities that deliver goods and services advocate.
Right. So there's already an advocacy.
Got to be very careful here, but some people have said that there's been a war on charities. There hasn't been. There are rules that say you are free to advocate as long as you deliver charity services or goods. It's a legal argument to say if you deliver none, you can apply for this higher form of charitable status, PBI, and then I or someone else has to decide whether you're still a charity worthy or a charity worthy of your PBI status. So in other words, people are always knocking on the taxpayer's door and they'll think of any argument to get to the taxpayer's pocket. It's a thin blue line, if the ACNC is blue, it's a thin blue line that says you have to jump over some hurdles before you get in. Right. And I just think we have to make those hurdles more distinct, apply the rules to PBI, which are rules about delivery of goods, like show me what you are doing. And no one is suggesting that you shouldn't advocate as you do those things. That's your added value.
So does that mean that as Commissioner you're currently not satisfied with the transparency of what you actually have to look at in the sector?
I think that there are too many people who are not grounded in their advocacy. Most are. All the big charities are not going to worry about my suggested changes. They won't fall foul of this. But as I say, I think there's a new class of charity that doesn't want to get their hands dirty and just wants to lobby. And they'll tell you that. And I think, well, anyone can lobby.
You don't need to be a charity.
You don't need to be a charity. And we always invite people to go off the register. You just go and do your thing. It's whether you want access to taxpayer support that is the question here.
I see. Terrific, Gary, thank you. I'm sure there are other questions, so don't hesitate to put your hands up. So I can see one there, Jim Franklin. And then one here and one here.
What do you think of deductible gift recipient status for entities whose main purpose is to conduct ideological warfare at a fairly general level, for example, Quadrant?
Oh! The same
is Keith
test,
Windshuttle here?
the same test would apply. For instance, If it sets out to educate, then that's a charitable purpose. If there's an organisation which is involved in the arts or culture, and it delivers culture, then it fulfills its purpose. The main thing here is to ask the question, are your monies devoted to the fulfilment of the charitable purpose, or is there something else going on here? So we have to ask what you do in the name of the charitable purpose, but there's no firm rule book. We can't say, well, it must be 1, 2 or 3, but it's got to look like 1, 2 or 3. So some cases at the margin, Jim, require a lot of thought, but usually when we're involved with an organisation where there's a contest over the application, we sit down and we literally try and work it out between us. It may involve changes to the objects of the organisation, or you may go off the register. And of course, Jim will be aware that I can't discuss any case that comes before us.
What a shame. Okay, so question, Philip.
Philip Wood. Gary, I'm not quite sure if you covered the question I'm about to ask. I'm thinking of the innocent, well-meaning private donor who donates $100 to a very good-sounding charity, only to find that 80 cents out of every dollar has gone on administration, marketing, compliance and so on, and only a small proportion of his or her donation has actually reached the people or the purpose that the original donor had in mind. Now, in a practical sense, what can be done to allow the donor to be informed about what percentage of his donation is going to go to the purpose that he has in mind?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I've thought about it for at least 10 years, and here's the answer. Okay. It's the cost and the burden of asking charities to report in the way that would enable the donor to have that question answered. There is no national standard of accounting that would enable you to simply just take apart all of the charities' financials, so that's one. So what we opted for is something a lot simpler, which is you can now come to the register and, not knowing the name of a charity, search by your charitable purpose. Just put the words in, sick puppy dogs or fallen trees or whatever, and you'll find comparable charities. Now ask your question, because I can tell you no matter how efficient the spend is of a charity and how miserly they are in their fundraising costs, you will not shift I don't think you'll shift your donor preference from hospitals to dog pounds on the basis of that information. In fact, there's 30 years of experience in the US of this, of having some information that compared efficiencies, financial efficiencies, and donors said, well, that's really good, I'm donating over here. So donations come from the heart. It's sunk, yeah. We will give you comparable information, so you get 3 nursing homes, 3 hospitals, 3 dog pounds or whatever. And that simplifies and makes a lot less expensive the search, just simple economics. So you only have to go to 3 programs, and then I think you can begin to have a look at 3 sets of books rather than many, and you might decide on the basis of financials. But what appear to be simple ratios are actually very complicated, and as you know, you'll write a rule and people will game it, so you can end up with the wrong sort of competition.
Terrific, thank you. There was the gentleman here had a question, I think. Would you mind just identifying yourself before asking the question? Yeah.
Richard Ouvrier. I'm 54 and a half, so I think I'm not a minor. And I'm just wondering, that's 32 years after the law determines that someone is not a minor. So it's a long time to... I frankly myself think that you're an adult at 30. But the question is this: are you essentially worried about people like Greta Greenberg setting herself up to educate maybe the United Nations or the Australian government when she has Asperger's syndrome and hasn't been to school for about 4 years? Is that the sort of advocacy or education that you're worried about subsidising with taxpayer funds?
I worry about advocacy from anyone that has no basis in concrete activity. Otherwise, I say, where is the added value? Why should we subsidise that advocacy as opposed to any other advocacy? So that's it. It's a distinction between... The question is, where is the value in charitable work to Australia? All charities could simply not register with us, not get the tax advantages and get on with their good work. Many do, by the way. We don't own the name charity. We own the concept of a registered charity. There are lots of charities that just get on about their business and don't take any taxation relief. So, to me, it's an old deal. You give the taxation relief, there are assumptions there that you'll pursue your charitable purpose. But, you know, I think there's a rise of a policy class in the last 30 or 40 years, of which I'm one, that makes a good living out of describing the world in a way that says it's going to hell in a handbasket when it isn't. And I prefer that if I'm to listen to that sort of person, usually highly educated, that they've done something from which they've learned. They have some concrete activity that says, I can help this person, I can relieve suffering, I know what it will take to restore animals in the bush or whatever. That's the distinction, it's not the individual as such.
Gary, we do have time for another question or two.
Jim Sternhell, how do you deal with blatantly fraudulent so-called charities? So in America you've got George Soros and his Open Societies, presumably he's getting one hell of a tax break from that, and the Clinton Foundation, which took Australian taxpayers down for 88 million, plus another 420 million, I think it was, to Clinton Foundation Associates. Only probably a million, if that, of all the Clinton Foundation money sort of shaken down from world governments actually did anything. It was a fraud. How do you prevent that from happening?
Well, we do it every day. We have investigations of charities that either don't fulfil their purpose or where the money does not return to the purpose. So it can, if it goes for private benefit, or in a sense if there's too much used for administration, but there's no simple rule there. You can ask the question, is this the proper use of those charitable funds? We have on the books maybe 70 or 80 investigations running at any one time, but I can't tell you about them because the tax, my act, which comes from the Tax Act, says I must be silent on those, even after Friday when I'm out of the job. But be assured, that'll be the predominant investigation. It's the fraudulent or the misuse of funds. But I can say that out of 60,000 charities, we have 2,000 complaints against charities a year, many not serious. They're internal disputes because someone didn't get to be president this year. We'll leave that to them. But the serious stuff, it's down in the scores each year. So that it's a healthy sector, I think. It really is.
I think we've got time for another one. There are some concrete philanthropic benefits available in the foyer. And I want to make sure you all get to take advantage of those. Just justify our DGR status. Lady here had a question.
Hi, Julie Garland McClellan. I'm very interested in some of the problems that arise from very well-intentioned but not terribly skillful board members in the sector, particularly as government is now moving to enforce good governance. We're seeing things like the aged care commissions and the NDIS is getting much tougher on governance. You did some wonderful work with the RACP. What are your views on upskilling directors in the sector?
Well, we have a rule book, literally 5 governance standards, and you breach one of those, and we can throw. No, sorry,
You've
the
got
6th
six
one.
now.
The 6th one we don't really use. It was with great respect a device to get people into the redress scheme. I can say that anyway. But the 5 substantive ones, the responsibilities of responsible persons, directors, trustees and so on. Now, 2 things. Out of the Royal Commission comes, out of the various Royal Commissions, is one simple rule. When it comes down to saving, say, an abused child or a consumer of a banking product and the reputation of your institution, there's no doubt now you've got to look after this one. Right? There are no excuses anymore. So that sets a tone, a culture. In terms of the practice, I don't know if a skilled person on a board is any better at making that decision at all. So I don't think we should over-egg the business of skills. I can think of a charity in Gympie I visited a couple of years ago, disability charity. They insisted that disabled people sat on their board so that they had that grounding. But you can't do that with every group. So the first principle is you put the dependent person, the beneficiary, first in all instances, and then you build a way of knowing that. That to me is the key. How do you get to know it? Well, you might have a separate committee. You might constantly be out there among talking to your beneficiaries. You might, if people have been on the board for 20 years, you might suggest that they're too close to the action. You know, there are devices you can use, which we've all learned in political parties, I suppose, that try to keep you on the ball, up to the measure. But with great respect, I don't think it's just about formal skills. You've got to have the interest and, dare I say, the passion, but you have to keep thinking of the beneficiary. That's what the game's about, not the charity.
So just one more, David Robertson here.
Yeah, my name's David Robertson. As a Scotsman, I'm very interested in money and in being generous with it. I've been intrigued by an underlying debate which came to the surface recently with Peter Fitzsimons in the Sydney Morning Herald and with others on the question of whether religions can be charities. I was intrigued by your comment that religions were still the largest charitable sector. And I'd like to just ask your thoughts on that, because in an increasingly maybe secular society, people don't understand that. They can understand if we give out food parcels, but the old adage about what's better, to give a man a fish or teach him how to fish, for a lot of us, we are trying to help people improve their lives and so on. I would regard that as a very charitable purpose, but I suspect some of the more militant secularists would not see it as such a thing. So is there a danger that religion will no longer be considered a charitable purpose and we would have to provide what they would see as something more concrete, but what I would see as actually something more ethereal?
I don't think there's any danger whatsoever. I really don't. Religion is the base of this sector, has been from day one, and the Assistant Minister in the new government has been asked that question and said, we won't be touching religion as a charitable purpose, because I think he understands it would not only set off a wildfire, you would pull the heart out of a lot of religious institutions. And this is not just churches. These are churches or religious institutions that have built the hospitals and schools, and not to mention the learning and the whole bit. There'd be a slice of the electorate that, of course, wants to do that, but I think about 90% of people would say, don't touch that. That's not sensible.
Gary, before we close, I wonder if I can, with your indulgence, just put on my hat as a Western Civilisation Centre, because we're always interested in the long picture civilisational dimensions of questions that our speakers raise. And in this case, what interests me particularly is kind of a tension between the word philanthropy and the word charity. And the tension is there because they go back to the two sources of Western civilization, which is classical Greek culture on one hand and the New Testament on the other hand. And the word philanthropy was first ever used in a play written in the 5th century BC by Aeschylus. A play is called Prometheus Bound, and it's the story of Prometheus, the great Titan, who brought fire to mankind. And the symbol here is that by doing that, he enabled humanity to become civilized. In other words, civilization was made possible by the great Titan, and in return he was punished by the tyrannical king of the gods, that was Zeus, for doing this. And his punishment was gory. He was having his liver pecked out every day by an eagle. And then because he was a Titan, it grew back, and then the eagle came back again the next day. So it's pretty mean punishment. But so in a way, what I'm getting at there is that it's a kind of conflict between philanthropy and tyranny, right at the heart of the Greek meaning of the word philanthropy. But more to the point, what Prometheus did was a concrete benefit to humanity. He brought fire, which enabled us to become, in the myth, everything that humanity can become. So that's philanthropy. Yeah. On the other hand, in the case of charity, and I cannot resist because the words are so beautiful, and I'm sure you all know them, though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or as a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I can move mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And even though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know as I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So it's a very different conception from philanthropy, because basically what it's saying is it's a kind of disposition of pure spiritual love, whereas philanthropy is concretely giving something. So what I want to put to you, Gary, is that you are a Greek. Rather than a New Testament guy. You're
I'm
saying
Cornish,
that
I'm telling you.
Just being kind of generally well disposed to everybody is not what you're talking about. You're talking about something that's that concretely demonstrable.
I'm talking about proof,
right,
as a way of charity reproving itself to an electorate that may be drifting from it. I'm also seeking to buttress the great works of charity and to have it distinguished from ideology. We can all play politics. Charities can play politics too, but they bring something very special in the work they do. They bring organisation and experience and insight. You know, the Red Cross, when we investigated Red Cross, it was an investigation 6 months on from the bushfire. I let them know we would be doing that. They were able to tell me the story of their experience. How would they know to hold back monies knowing that hundreds of people would come 6 months later to seek relief? And those people are just as needy as those who came day one, but they eked it out, they tried, and then they fell over. So that insight comes from experience. Now, whether that's on the philanthropic side or the charity side, I don't know. But charities are a very special beast. I want to hang on to the specialness. I want it distinguished from the other game in town, which is to tax people, take their money from them and disperse it. I don't understand that game as others might in the room, but I understand it reasonably well. That's not charity.
Yeah.
So all I'm asking for is to recrystallise, make the lines a bit clearer, and I think we'll maintain a really vibrant charitable sector.
Gary, it's been a real privilege and a fascinating thing to hear from the outgoing Commissioner about this subject that's very close to our hearts and to everybody's here. So please give Gary Johns a warm hand.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic.